Jackie Mack, Senior Program Manager, and I manage grants in the Santee Lynches and Lower Savannah COG areas. Today I will be discussing the financial management requirements of SCIIP awards, including areas that are unique to this new federal funding not seen in previous RIA grants. During normal RIA funding cycles, grantees were required to maintain a financial management system using generally accepted accounting principles to provide adequate accountability for the grant. With SCIIP, this is the same requirement, but with the added bar of being in accordance with the Uniform Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements found in 2 CFR Part 200. Additionally, with SCIIP, grantees and their subrecipients and contractors must certify that they are not presently debarred, suspended, proposed for debarment, declared ineligible, or voluntarily excluded from receiving federal funds. Lastly, SCIIP will require grantees to conduct audits of grant funds in accordance with 2 CFR 200 Subpart F whenever more than $750,000 in federal funds are expended in a given fiscal year. It's important that grantees keep accurate information about the grant to include grant award, obligations, unobligated balances, assets, liabilities, expenditures, and revenues. RIA will review this information at monitoring and closeout. There is also a requirement to include a cash receipts journal, cash disbursements journal, and a general ledger to record all transactions. The cash management system used by the grantee must minimize the time between receipts and disbursement of grant funds. Grantees should generally spend funds within 10 days of receipt, meaning from the day the initial deposit from the State Treasurer's Office hits your bank account. Budget control procedures should be in place that allow grantees to compare actual expenditures with budgeted amounts for each activity, as well as correct any variances between the two. Financial information must be related to performance or productivity data. One way to accomplish this is by including the development of unit cost information whenever appropriate or specifically required in the grant agreement. Providing cost information can demonstrate cost-effective practices. Progress reports are another tool used to help monitor program outcomes and productivity. Grantees must have sound internal control procedures to account for all transactions accurately, whether that involves cash, property, or other assets. These procedures should include things such as segregating staff duties, obtaining and documenting proper approval for disbursements, and reviewing and reconciling transactions with bank statements on a regular basis, i.e. monthly. Grantees must adequately safeguard all property and other assets and ensure they are used solely for authorized purposes. Grant funds must be accounted for separately from the grantee's other funds. All income from a grant and expenditures from the grant should be accounted for as a distinct, separate category within your accounting system to ensure funds can be fully accounted for at all times. Although a separate bank account is not a requirement, opening one is recommended as it will allow for easier tracking of grant funds, especially for reporting and auditing requirements. Accounting records must be supported by source documentation. This documentation must show that expenditures occurred during the grant period, that they were only for allowable costs, and were approved by authorized officials. Of course, any pre-award expenses incurred on or after March 3, 2021 are eligible costs and should be submitted to RIA for review. Records should also document that checks were only written for invoiced amounts for the referenced project. And finally, separate accounting records must be maintained by grantees with multiple grant awards. One of the first forms that you will submit to RIA is an Authorized Signatures for Payments and Checks form. A hard copy was included in the award package that you received, and it must be completed and submitted to RIA prior to the issuance of a notice to proceed. Although we accept the number of forms electronically, this particular form must be mailed back to us with original wet pen and ink signatures. And if you've had a state grant with us in the past, you're probably familiar with this form. It is used to designate persons who are authorized to review and certify requests for payment of grant funds for eligible expenses, as well as sign checks for the expenditure of grant funds. The grantee's chief executive official must designate at least two persons other than themselves that are approved to sign checks and request payments. If the chief executive official also needs to request payments or sign checks, then the next highest elected official or board official must authorize the signatures on the form. There are examples included in the grant project management procedures that indicate how the form should be completed to properly authorize officials. I'll show you a few of those examples on the next slide. The form is designed for up to 6 signatures, and it's best to designate more than 2 persons, if applicable, in case one of the signers is not available when a check needs to be written. As I alluded to a moment ago, depending on the applicant and its management structure, the following are examples of authorizing officials designating individuals that have been approved to make requests for payment or sign checks. Note that the titles shown in dark blue are the authorizing officials, and the titles below them are those individuals who are approved to sign checks and RFPs. The town administrator may authorize the town clerk and public works director. The mayor may authorize the town administrator and town clerk. A council chair may authorize the mayor and town administrator. The executive director of a water or sewer authority may authorize the finance director and operations director. The board chairperson of a water or sewer authority may authorize the executive director and finance director. Keep in mind that we will review the form as part of our startup technical assistance meetings to ensure that local procedures conform to this requirement for signatures. Now, in the past, there has been some confusion with the forms as it relates to who can sign checks in particular. It's important to note that the person who signs in Block 4 cannot sign requests for payment or checks to the contractor. Therefore, if the mayor needs to sign checks, for instance, then the next highest elected authorized official for the grantee must sign Block 4. It can be the mayor pro tem, a council member, etc. Likewise, if the general manager needs to sign checks, then a commissioner or other authorized person should sign Block 4. If there are staff changes, please remember to update the form and mail it to RIA to ensure there is documentation of at least 2 authorized persons throughout the entire grant period. Again, the revised form must contain original signatures, and of course, you can access a blank form off our website under Forms and Documents. Grantees are responsible for effectively administering the SCIIP award and ensuring the grant funds are used only for allowable costs. Effective administration includes reviewing all documentation and plans, making sure the budget and other financial concerns are being taken care of, as well as addressing any questions or concerns that may arise. Proper administration is crucial to the success of the project. Sound management practices include being responsive and timely on all inquiries from RIA, sending reports when they are due, and particularly for the SCIIP awards, ensuring that the project gets underway quickly in order to meet the December 31st, 2026 deadline for grant expenditures. The grantee should carefully review the grant agreement, project management procedures, and other program documentation to ensure that the project is being administered consistent with program objectives and terms and conditions of the grant award. Allowable costs are those activities detailed in the grant application. If additional work is needed, RIA would have to approve the costs in advance via contract change orders and grant amendments. Depending upon the nature of the additional work, there is no guarantee that the cost will be allowed. In those cases, the grantee may commit to providing local funds to pay for the additional work themselves. Further, SCIIP funds cannot pay for in-kind labor or other specified local costs. And lastly, the grantee is responsible for any cost overruns required to complete the project, unless otherwise approved. Prior to the first request for payment, the grantee must ensure that all relevant subrecipient and third-party contracts have been authorized by RIA and that an RIA notice to proceed has been issued. When the grantee is ready to request grant funds for eligible expenses, an RIA request for payment or RFP form must be submitted. Invoices and other relevant documentation, including contract change orders, must be submitted with RFPs. Also, a reminder that the grantee should carefully review all invoices and compare them to the budget. And the engineer should approve contractor payments before completing an RFP. Additionally, there's an obligation, which is new with the SCIIP program, to submit a contractor pay request certification to confirm that expenses incurred are in compliance with all applicable federal requirements. Shown on this slide is the contractor pay request certification form, which indicates that the contractor followed the required provisions as applicable in accordance with the contract terms and conditions. The provisions include contract work hours, which basically requires workers to be compensated at a rate of 1.5 times the basic rate of pay for hours worked in excess of 40 hours in a work week. The Safety Standards Act, which ensures compliance with safety standards requirements of OSHA, Title 29, etc. Davis-Bacon wages. So projects in excess of $10 million funded in whole or in part with federal, non-state, and local fiscal recovery funds must comply with Davis-Bacon Act. And debarment and suspension, which means that SCIIP funds cannot go to individuals or entities that are prohibited from doing business with the federal government. Again, the form must be signed by the contractor and submitted with every contractor's pay application involving federal funds. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the grantee must submit the authorized signatures for payment and checks form, which includes a list of all authorized officials that are able to request SCIIP funds and sign checks for the expenditure of SCIIP funds. One of these designated persons, as listed in Block 3, must sign the RFP. Requests can be on an advance or reimbursable basis, but advance payments will only be considered if there is an approved invoice for eligible work or services completed that are due and payable. Reimbursement requests should be accompanied by a copy of the canceled check written to the contractor for SCIIP eligible work. And the check should be signed by 2 of the persons listed in Block 3 on the authorized signatures form. The request for payment form itself is pretty self-explanatory. We do ask that you complete it in its entirety where applicable. For instance, the form captures information for federal grant funds as well as state grant funds. If you do not have a state grant that was approved in conjunction with the SCIIP award, then obviously that section will not be applicable. However, we do track all grant funds as well as all local investment committed and spent for the project on this form. And the form is a fillable PDF with automatic calculations. RIA will review the RFPs for consistency with the approved scope of work and budget and approve them for payment. Checks or deposits are issued from the State Treasurer's Office or STO and will be mailed to the grantee directly or direct deposited into the grantee's bank account. Now, most grantees probably have an established direct deposit account with the Treasurer's Office for other state payments. If you do not already have this in place, register with STO for Automated Clearinghouse Payments or ACH. You can also request them to designate the terms to be immediate payment by submitting a request in writing. See the project management procedures for details. For those grantees with direct deposit account, Please note that the payment will likely go into the general fund account, and you will then need to promptly transfer or deposit it into the account designated for the grant, since you only have 10 days to disburse funds. To assist with the timely processing of payments to contractors, RIA will notify grantees when payment is made by STO. Now let me re-emphasize these basic financial management requirements, which are not new to the SCIIP program. As I just stated, grantees must disperse grant funds within 10 days of receiving them. 2 authorized officials must sign all checks for SCIIP-funded expenses, unless otherwise authorized. It's important that this is done properly for all checks written to the contractors. You do not want to jeopardize these funds. We see too often where the checks have only one signature or 2 signatures that are not authorized for the grant. And remember, for purposes of the grant, authorized does not mean persons authorized by local procedures, but instead, persons designated on the authorized signatures for payments and checks form. Lastly, disbursements of SCIIP funds can only be made for eligible work that has been completed in accordance with the contract, as well as any approved change orders or contract amendments. All financial documentation supporting grantees' request for payment and disbursement of grant funds must be kept in the grantee's files and be available for review at any time. With regards to local match and the leveraging of other funds, the grantee is expected to have available all funds that were specified in the application at the time of grant award. The local investment may not include any federal, non-state, and local fiscal recovery funds or American Rescue Plan Act funds, unless otherwise approved by the federal agency. Generally, grant disbursements will be made on a pro rata basis with the local investment. However, our RIA will consider requests to allow expending SCIIP funds in advance of local match or state-funded RIA grants when necessary to meet the federal expenditure deadline. Either way, the grantee would still be responsible for contributing the required local investment as well as providing the appropriate financial documentation demonstrating said investment. Before I conclude this presentation, I want to cover audit requirements. Grantees will be required to provide RIA an annual audit in any year that expenses exceed the following thresholds. If less than $750,000 of SCIIP funds is spent during the grantee's fiscal year, the audit must adhere to either generally accepted audit standards per the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants or the General Accounting Office, whichever is applicable. If more than $750,000 is spent in the grantee's fiscal year, a single audit that adheres to audit standards per 2 CFR 200 Subpart F audit requirements must be provided. Federal award identification information for auditing purposes is located in Exhibit B of the grant agreement. And finally, any audit findings related to grant funds or any grant management findings must be immediately reported to RIA. The grantee will reimburse RIA for unauthorized and unwarranted expenditures disclosed in the audit, if so directed. That concludes the financial management overview. If you have any questions as you go about implementing your project, please feel free to contact us. We are here to help.